Yes, helpful in so many ways. I think the things that have struck me particularly in some ways is the, I mean, a phrase I really liked was the all us and no them, which is something which I would think, which I carry with me in our own church situation is, or people around, it's not us and them, it's us and us. And so that's a good thing, I think, to keep in mind. The people that we may differ with are still us in some ways. I guess the question is related to what we've been trying to do in the series, consider the actual situation of the war in Ukraine, but in light of what you've been saying, obviously the question is not how do Muslims view that war, or particularly, but that you, where is it? The distinction between a war that is because of religious reasons and the non-religious wars, in which ostensibly one could say what we found in the earlier sessions, that what looks particularly from the outside like a war of either aggression or a war of seeking to extend boundaries, which is essentially, I would say, a non-religious war, but that the religion has either played a central part or has been caught up into it, so that in the eyes of leaders and people, it is viewed as a holy war, even though it's against another Christian state. So that raises the time-old question, how do you know it's a religious war, and how do you know it's not just a land grab or something like that?
Yeah, I'm glad you've raised that, because what we tend to find is that sometimes, normal wars, if we can use that phrase, are dressed up as religious wars, or they're done, or they are intentionally dressed up in order to drum up support for them. So you may find, for example, in the Ukraine and Russian war, that in order to recruit more soldiers, then it might be pushed as a religious war on both sides in order to get more people involved. Because at the end of the day, it's trying to promise people heaven, that this is something that is God ordained, that this is something that you will get rewarded for. It's not just something you're doing for the sake of bravery or anything of that nature. So it is a difficult distinction to draw. I want to sort of bring your mind back, or cast your mind back to a few of the earlier slides where I spoke of the ijtihad of the scholar. So in reality, that it cannot be decided by politicians. Even when we had the earlier empires, they were still under the jurisdiction of the Sharia, even though the caliphs were non-Sharia experts, even though they were living like kings. They were doing pretty much everything that they were forbidden to do anyway. So therefore, the scholars, that's why you find the legal schools developed separately from the political systems. So you find the Hanafi legal school, the madaris, the madrasas, they developed, on a separate level. And in fact, we saw the caliphs punishing many of the founding members of the schools because they didn't toe the line. They didn't justify their extravagances. They didn't justify their actions. So they imprisoned them, and in some cases killed them. So that will exist. It is whether God wishes to guide those particular scholars in that particular place to issue an edict to say, this is actually a religious war. And therefore, in you engaging in this war will get you reward. Because the difference really from a religious war and a non-religious war is that in a religious war, you're aiming to get something in the next life. You're aiming to be rewarded for it. You expect God to be happy from you. Whereas in a non-religious, it's just a practical day-to-day kind of activity. So, so it really depends on the ijtihad of the ulama, and whether the ulama are independent from the state or dependent upon this. We've seen, for example, without naming particular Muslim countries, we've seen the leadership within Muslim countries imprisoning certain scholars because of a particular stance that they're taking. So that unfortunate dynamic is going to exist, and I think that will exist for as long as we're on the surface of this earth, that people will try to promote it and pitch it in a certain way in order to recruit more people, in order to justify certain actions that they may choose to do. How do we as people outside of that, I guess, once we have an agreement, for example, say, a person is living in country X, and country X says we're going to war, and you have a sort of we've talked about mu'ahada, we've talked about this contractual obligation, and you are contractually obliged because they're now kind of recruiting people for war. You are contractually obliged, so your contractual obligation now tells you that you must go for war. So it really depends how you end up in that situation, and whether it is considered as something you will get rewarded for, or something you will not get rewarded for, something you'll get punished for. Because in reality, when we speak of religion, that's really what is in the mind of a follower, is God pleased with me, or is God angry with me if I do this or I don't do this?